Welcome to This Is You, the podcast. As our journeys unfold, so do our identities. What makes you, you? This podcast explores how different life experiences, concepts, or themes like friendship, religion, loneliness impact how we see ourselves and the world. Join me on this journey as we talk to new guests and learn about their life experiences, reflect on our own, and see what it means for all of us going forward. Your journey to learn more begins now. Jawad Shuaib is an entrepreneur and partner at Budget Electronics, which is one of the top mobile accessory suppliers in Canada. Jawad and I have been friends for the last 17 years. He's a huge reader, and he's also one of the most interesting people I know. In today's conversation, we talk about character and why it can be so hard to say positive things about ourselves, but so much easier to say negative things. We discuss Jawad's upbringing and childhood and debate what it means to parent in a deliberate way. We talk about anxiety and anger and some of its root causes for Jawad. And interestingly, we also discuss how the movie Jurassic Park affected him in a profound way. As you listen to today's conversation, I want you to think about how you would describe Jawad's character based on our conversation alone, and let me know what you think. I did ask him if it was okay to post this question, and he said he was fine with it, and also interested in hearing what you'd have to say. So without further ado, here's Jawad.
Big part of however you end up as a person is based on your parents. But I think, as individuals, we always say, okay, we did this, we did that, and this is how I ended up here. But I think most of it is set maybe at the age of 5, 6, 7, like around that age, like your character. And I've always divided people into two things. I look at them in terms of their character and their personality. And I don't have a really good word for it, but I think character is the really deep-rooted stuff, like both the good and the bad. Are you an honest person, an angry person, a happy person? All of those things that are really important. And personality is the icing on the cake. You can have a good personality, you can have a bad personality, but a lot of the times, like, let's say you are on a dating app and you ask somebody, what do you do? You're really asking about their personality, not so much about their character. And also it's really hard to see the character unless you know the person. So I think the character part, the really important part of your life, is defined very early on, and your parents have a huge role to play in it. And so however they are is how you will end up being. And not just them, like also your environment around that time. But later on, your perspectives can change. So, personally, for me, I know the person I am today is exactly the same person I was when I was 5 years old. And the only things that have changed are my perspectives, which is always changing and should always change. But the person I am today is the same person I was back then. And I suspect that's the same for most people because it is such a defining period, in your life.
So is character for you the core of who you are, is your character? And you feel like that is mostly developed by the age of 5?
Yeah, not necessarily at the age of 5. I think I have a fairly good memory of when I was at that age. And I don't remember being any different. So like all the insecurities and all the good things and the bad things, all of them, I still have them. So I think nothing has changed in that sense. Maybe I'm better at projecting them and controlling them, but how I feel is the same.
That's so interesting to me. Okay, so what do you feel like your character is?
Very, very simple things. I think it's really hard to describe it as well.
Yeah.
I think, like, for example, I am a fairly, I don't even want to say anything because it's like kind of tooting my own horn, but the bad things are easier to say. I think I do have anxiety. I don't have anxiety issues about just about anything, but if I do something bad and I know I did something bad, I have like immense amount of anxiety for that. It's not entirely bad thing for other people, but it's not good for me because I can't do anything knowingly bad. And when I do it, I suffer from it because it haunts me. And so I can't even, for example, watch movies where somebody else has done something bad and they're about to be caught because I just can't take it.
It's not even like what you are doing that's bad. You can't watch something bad happen knowingly.
Yeah, exactly. It's like mirror neurons, right? Whatever I'm seeing is however I'm feeling in my head. So when you watch a horror movie, you're not thinking that ghost is coming to you, but that horror movie is just mirror neurons. You're feeling the same fear or uncertainty in your head. So it's the same thing. I think there are good things and the bad things, but it's easier to focus on the bad things rather than talk great about myself. But I think I still have the same character. But my perspective overall has changed a lot. And if anyone were to meet me, they would most likely see the perspective. Mm. And a lot of times when you make friends, like let's say I go to some networking event, you would make friends based on your perspective. You know, let's say I have a certain political perspective, certain religious bias or something like that. And I will build a friendship around that. But you'll find that a lot of those friendships sort of wither away over time because your perspectives naturally change, and they should change. But, you know, friends you make really early on, for example, I have dinner with a friend I know for 30 years, and he's my best friend. And his perspectives have changed a lot, and we are not alike at all, but I understand his character and he understands my character. And no matter what I do, it will always be there because it's deep rooted. So those friendships have a tendency to last forever. And I think that's the kind of relationship you have with your parents as well, because they see the character and not the sort of the personality that other people see. So you can have fights with your parents, but they're still okay with it at the end of the day because they're comfortable with that sort of character, whether it's good or bad.
So I've had a similar experience to you when it comes to friendship. Like what I've noticed is I have some friends I've known for a very, very long time, and some of them we have nothing in common. Like if you just took us on the street, you would never think we're friends because we're so different in our perspectives. But there's something fundamental that pulls us together, right? Either it's how we view the world or what we think that's really important in terms of being a good person or in terms of how we interact with people, etc. But there's something that ties you together. And I feel like those friendships last longer than friendships, like you're saying, that are based on having a common interest. Because once that common interest is gone, or if you're friends with somebody primarily because you spend time with them, when you don't spend as much time with them anymore, it's difficult to maintain that closeness.
Yeah, 100%.
I have friends who, like, I see once a year. But because our friendship was never based on seeing each other frequently, it feels like we just pick up where we left off. Or I have friends I haven't seen in years. But when we do see each other, that connection is still there because it's not based on spending time or having common interest, you know? It's based on something else that's really hard to put into words. So I hear you on that piece. Like, I think it's hard to describe. I'm going to go back to something you said a little earlier. I think the reason it's easier to talk about our negative traits is that it seems more socially acceptable. It's very hard to talk about like what you think is good about you without feeling like you're bragging or boasting or not being humble, you know?
Yeah.
And that could even be acknowledging it to yourself, like to say to yourself that, oh, I'm good or I'm good at this. I think for a lot of people, they have trouble even saying it to themselves because it seems like they're being conceited or arrogant or something like that, you know?
Yeah, and that's a big problem. I, in fact, read somewhere that it's a very common thing, and it's a good idea to just own it. And so, for example, when somebody gives you a compliment, instead of naturally we say, oh, no, that's not me or whatever, you're more humble about it.
Yeah.
But it's good to just accept it and then just move on instead of fighting back at it. But it's interesting. I never used to really think about it, but definitely I think people do it all the time. I know I do it all the time. So sometimes it's better just to take the compliment and run with it.
One time I was talking to someone and I was saying how I have such difficulty accepting a compliment, or if someone compliments me, I feel like I need to say, oh no, that's not the case. It's just for this reason, and or compliment them back. I feel awkward. Like I need to return the favor. It feels uncomfortable to me. And I was like, I don't know what to say when someone compliments me. And they were like, just say thank you. I was like, that sounds so simple, but it's so weird to do.
There's a book I really want to read. It's called Brag. It's about ability to brag without coming off as a douche, basically. So I haven't read it yet, but hoping to get to it sometime. But I think part of what you probably have to deal with is because you are so crazily emotionally intelligent, and it's a curse.
Jeez, Jawad, I was gonna say thank you, and now
No, it's a curse. It's a curse for you, not for anyone else. It's like having O negative blood. You can help everyone else, but nobody can see what you feel. So for example, you are more emotionally intelligent than I am. So I can say some stuff, maybe I've already said some stuff that you might pick up on and might actually subtly hurt you. Yeah. But you are emotionally intelligent enough to recognize it. But I am not emotionally intelligent enough to even know that I did it. And the problem with emotional intelligence is the same as with IQ. Everyone thinks they have it. I think I have it. I think I have above average IQ, but everyone thinks they have above average IQ. So somebody is obviously wrong. And
we can't all be above average, and the average would go up.
Exactly. So we all have some degree of emotional intelligence and IQ, but it is some sort of a curse for the person who has it, because they can always help other people. They can recognize when the other person is hurt, and they can also use it for nefarious reasons to hurt the other person subtly.
Yep.
But when somebody hurts you, they might not even recognize that they hurt you, and you just have to take it.
See, I think what I've gotten much better at is being able to talk to people when that happens. And what I really respect is, and I think this is true of you, Jawad, that maybe you won't be aware if you've hurt someone, but I feel like if someone told you that you hurt me, you would hear that openly and have dialogue about it and accept it, not be like, no, you're being too emotional, you're being too sensitive. I feel like whenever I've had any conversation with you, you've always deeply listened to what the other person is saying and taken what they were saying at full value, not diminishing them, not dismissing them, you know? And I think that's so important. That is a part of EQ to me as well, where you're able to understand that your perspective is just one perspective. It's not the perspective.
Arusa, if you have something to say to me, just say it. Okay? You don't have to package it.
I actually don't have anything to say. I don't think you've ever hurt my feelings in a way that has like stuck or anything like that. Because I actually think you do have above average IQ.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I feel like you're one of the most smartest people I know. And smart not in a arrogant know-it-all sort of way, but smart in the constantly learning and seeking information, and you're just very curious. Like the amount of books you have in your home and the amount of books that you've read and the way that you hear people and take in what they're thinking and adjust your perspectives, or sometimes stick to your perspectives depending on what people are saying. I think you have a unique ability to be very open yet also articulate your point. You're not easily swayed, but at the same time it's very easy to talk to you about anything, I feel like, because you're so open.
I will take that as a compliment, and it's a good thing, I think. But I find that a lot of it, again, goes back to way back. I remember like starting very early on, I was already starting to get very curious about things I don't know. But, you know, it's funny because I know Isa loves dinosaurs. But way before him, I was the original dinosaur fan. and
in history, you mean? Like the
I was the original dinosaur fan, okay? So
Okay.
nobody can take that away from me.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah, and you know, it was a really big moment in my life. I remember it was September 1994 when I watched Jurassic Park, and I went from knowing absolutely nothing to being absolutely fanatical about dinosaurs, to the point that I started collecting frogs. I made an Isla Nublar island in my backyard, and I dug up some holes, put the frogs in there, put fences around. I even took some blood sample using a syringe and put it in a lizard. And my dad taught me how to open up frogs and operate on them. So I got my sister's bio book and I started dissecting them pretty professionally, I must say. You know, I literally like at least 2 frogs a day I would put under like they were alive, and I would start operating on them. And I did that for a long time. And that sort of started it all. Like, I think Jurassic Park really changed my view because I'd never even known about dinosaurs. So suddenly seeing those, you know, I started collecting chicken bones to make my own skeletons. So that kind of started it all. And then, you know, one thing led to another. My parents were very open, by the way. So that's another thing I should mention. My parents where credit is due. So my parents never forced anything on us. So, you know, you find sometimes like this kind of a parent thing to do is to get kids into piano lessons, into, I don't know, like football lessons or whatever lessons. And we kind of want them to pick up these skills all for good reasons. My parents never really forced anything on me, but they always nudged me in the direction that I was interested in. So when I was interested in dinosaurs, my dad saw that I was interested in collecting frogs and stuff. So he helped me build like a little lab in my room for collecting all the frogs. So my room smelled like crap, but I had a lot of frogs in them. And later on, when my dad saw that I was interested in computers, he got me a computer. This was also like 1994, very important year. I started learning computer programming because my granddad mentored me to learn it. And another example is, one day my dad brings home a bunch of electronic components like resistors, transistors, capacitors,
Yeah.
And he said he doesn't know anything about them, but if I'm interested, he can get me like someone to teach me. So I was like, yeah, for sure. And then he got someone to teach me some of the electronics. So I started learning how to build circuits. And again, I became very intrigued by it.
Yeah.
And my parents, again, were very liberal. And considering that some of the stuff is pretty dangerous, like I was working with soldering irons. I think I was maybe 10 years old at that time. So I was working with soldering irons. I burned my arms 3-4 times, like major burns. And one time I wanted to build an electromagnet. And I remember I put like the 2 wires into the electric socket.
Oh my God.
And it was 220 volts. So it's twice the voltage. It was bad. But my parents never like really discouraged it. And that kind of kept me going. It's a really difficult balance, how you not be overprotective, because you only get one chance at life, right? So if you're dead, you're dead.
Exactly.
My parents really helped with like nudging me in the right direction without really forcing anything. So when I became like really interested in books, they would take me to the bookshop like every weekend. And it was all out of my own interest. It was never like, okay, let's go to the bookshop. It was always I would ask for it. My parents would take me there. So that worked out, I think.
Yeah. Well, based on all the books you have and all the programming you do and everything else, yeah, I would say it definitely has worked out for you. I think going back to what you were just saying, which is how do you figure out what that balance looks like, especially now? Because I think even when we were growing up, so you were in Pakistan at this time?
Yeah, I was in Pakistan until I was 14 years old.
So in Pakistan too, I feel like it's a little bit more relaxed than it is even here. So my parents were, back in that time, like you could go to the park without your parents and that was not a big deal. Like you went with your friends. And now the idea of being able to send your kid to the park, even if you're okay with it, other parents may call CPS on you because there's so much covering when it comes to kids, right? And I think, my parents were, I don't think they were overprotective, but there was a lot of like, you're going to get hurt, don't do this, you're going to get hurt, don't do that. But still, compared to current standards, I would say they were more open than what is socially acceptable now. In Pakistan, especially when it comes to animals and it comes to like doing stuff, kids are left more to their own devices to like explore and do things, and it's not seen in the same way as it's seen here.
Yeah, I definitely got very, very lucky, and it's all luck, so I can't really take too much credit for that. But I grew up in Pakistan Air Force, so my dad was in the Air Force, and we lived in a gated and heavily guarded community. And as I was growing up, it was a new community, so all the buildings were going up, the new houses were being developed, our school, hospitals, mosque, and golf club, and officers' mess, everything was being developed right before my eyes. And in that kind of environment, every day was a new day for me. So I have a lot of memories from that time, because if you have a job and you do the same thing every single day, you don't remember any single day even if you do it for 10 years. But if every day is changing, you have a lot of memories of it. So that was like one thing. And the second thing was all the officers in that camp were recruited around the same age. So when they had kids, they were also all the same age. So there were like thousands of kids that were my age. And we were in this one community that was super safe community with our own military police. And, you could play with the same kids, you go to school with the same kids, you end up in the hospital with the same kids. So it was a kind of environment that was very safe.
Yeah.
And so you could explore it more easily. But now, especially in Canada, for example, you have to be so careful with your kids, especially what other parents could say or what could possibly happen to the kids. But there is a consequence to this that is unintended consequence. Like, for example, all the kids are now developing allergies, right? These allergies came out of nowhere and never even heard of peanut allergies until we come here.
Yeah.
So how does that happen? Because we try to be too clean, and then there's a consequence for that as well. So it's really hard to know where exactly the sort of the border is. And I think like our parents, or at least my parents, weren't like some brilliant parents at all. Like they were just like winging it.
Take the credit back. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. I mean, I think they were just winging it. And I think I'm not a parent, so I can't say it. But I think maybe we focus so much on parenting here, just like we focus so much on self-help here, that maybe some of it is just sort of natural. And it doesn't have to be so planned. At least for my parents, they didn't plan much for me. So I can only take examples from where I can.
Well, some of that, it makes me think of the whole nature versus nurture piece, right? So like when I was growing up, I remember in grade 11, I was taking like sociology, anthropology, and psychology class or something. And there was a whole conversation around nature versus nurture and what's more important, or are they equally balanced, etc. And at that time, I really was a heavy proponent in nurture, right? I felt like the environment that you're around and the people that you interact with and all of that plays a much larger role than the nature part. And I sort of felt that way still until I had Isa, and I saw, wow, he is so much like me and Aman in like these really weird sort of ways that he never saw us do any of those things. But he has the same mannerisms, or his brain thinks the same way, or he has some of the same like likes and dislikes. And it's not because of exposure, because we're not like that now, but we were when we were kids.
Right.
Right. And so now I feel like it's a combination, and it's hard to even say, is it 50-50 or what? I think it's just a very unique blend.
I think you have nature versus nurture, and nature probably plays a huge role, much larger role than even we think it plays. I think where nurture comes in is sort of world-class performance, where you really have to perform at your best. That's when nurture really has to take place. You can't be a naturally born chess player. You can't be a naturally born musician. You can have certain features for it, like Michael Phelps. I was reading his Wikipedia page, and it literally says he has like a dolphin-like body. So that is obviously nature. But to see those results now, there will be a million people like that. But to see that his edge is going to come from nurture, not from nature alone. But you need both at the end of the day. If you're a basketball player and you're a short guy like me, you're not going to go get anywhere, right? So I think that it has elements of both.
It's like the 10,000 hours. Have you read about that?
Yeah, Michael Gladwell.
Yes. It's about exposure and how much you get to practice. And some of the most brilliant people, or some of the most talented people, it's the exposure they had to technology or to that sport or to whatever that played a huge role in them being able to be where they are, right?
Yeah. I mean, Mozart, I believe, composed his first piece when he was 9 years old. And people say, okay, he was a musical prodigy. But in fact, he started training for it when he was 4 years old. And he was training for it full time.
Wow.
So he had already reached 10,000 hours faster than most people would have. So I can't really attest to too much of that, because I don't think I've spent 10,000 hours doing anything useful. But
I don't know. I feel like...
there's some argument for it.
I feel like when you're talking about your exposure to computer programming, for example, coming at a young age, or just even playing with transistors or doing frog surgery, right? Like all of those things are things that not everybody is exposed to or has the opportunity to do. And you were given it at a time where you were interested and had the time to explore it freely without that many restrictions. It wasn't like, oh, you're going to get hurt. Like, you're interested. Go see what happens.
My parents, without trying so much, I think really helped me in that regard, in terms of building my curiosity. Later on, just a few years before coming to Canada, my parents built like a proper lab for me. And it was a lab separate from my room. So I had a room which I shared with my brother, but I had a separate lab and only I was allowed in it. And I called it Jawad Research Laboratory, JRL. And it wasn't like I was doing some mad science in there, but it was like my space to work on whatever I felt like working on. It was mostly electronics. And I remember watching a movie called October Sky. I don't know if you've seen it, but
No.
it's like 10th grade kids building rockets and then they become really good at it. And it's based on true story. So I started building rockets right after that. And again, like, building rockets is not the safest thing to do in the world, but my parents let me do it. And it's a good lesson, right? Like, you only learn from your mistakes. And if you don't make any mistakes, then you learn all the wrong lessons.
Or you don't learn any lessons at all.
Yeah.
That's a hard one for me personally, because where is that line? You were saying before too, you want to protect your kids, but you also want them to be able to explore and do things and learn things. And what is the balance between that? And that looks different for every kid, every person, every parent, But do you feel like your parents, in terms of their personalities, are also very curious and open? Like, do you think that comes from them?
No.
Interesting. Okay, so why do you say no? There was no hesitation either. You were like, no, that's not. So how would you describe your parents?
My parents, I think my dad is very liberal.
Okay.
And my mom is very religious. So they're sort of opposites in that sense. A sense, like, she's more conservative. My dad is more like left. So that has definitely heavily influenced me in terms of both giving me some sense of like morality and at the same time giving me a sense of like, okay, don't take it so seriously. So definitely in that regard. But the reason why I say, I don't think I got this from my parents is because all my siblings, they're all very different. And one thing I didn't say, which is very embarrassing for me to say, but sometimes I'm proud of it too.
Okay.
I failed really bad in school. I was very, very bad in school. Like, I was the second worst student in my class of 35 kids consistently for 11 years that I was studying in Pakistan. I was definitely the worst kid. And at the same time, my brother, he was in the same school and he was at the top of the school, not even just his class. He was the top student in the entire school every year. And he even got like a scholarship into high school, which is sort of unheard of in Pakistan, but he got a scholarship. He was the only kid with a scholarship. And it's a polar opposite. And again, my sisters were also very different. But I wouldn't say any one of them have that much resemblance to me in the sense of curiosity. I think curiosity is something that was sort of my unique attribute, and they had their own unique attributes.
So a few comments. One is, in school, especially in Pakistan, from my understanding, is there's a huge focus on memorization and regurgitation. And your skill set, I think, is a lot more about application of information. And you're very experiential when you learn. Like, you wanted to open up frogs and you collected bones, and you wanted to experiment with things, not follow like a rigid set of rules or guidelines. You want to try stuff. And that type of personality is not really rewarded in a Pakistani school system. You could argue even in a Canadian school system to some degree, right? Like, your aptitude to learn and process information and apply it in different ways is not necessarily the focus in traditional schooling.
Obviously, this is biased because I did bad in school. I would say it was a complete waste of my time, even going to the school.
Yeah.
It was entirely rote memory.
Yeah.
It was just rote memory. And you'll find like students who come Pakistani schools have really good memory when they come here. So actually, it's funny, when I did come to Canada, I thought the school system was really silly over here because it was so easy. And the math class was basically drawing graphs. And at first I thought it was really dumb. But then, many, many years later, I realized that they were just preparing you to have an intuitive sense for calculus.
Yeah.
Calculus and English are probably two most important subjects you will take in the entire education system. So they were training you for that. And that, combined with critical thinking, I realized that that's really what the edge is.
It's your ability to analyze what you're reading or what you're seeing and see more than just what's on the surface. Instead of memorizing the facts, you're thinking about the implications, which is what you need to have to be able to contribute to anything, right? It's not what you see on the surface, but deeper than that. I think the reason I asked you about the openness with your parents, and I hear you in that your siblings are all different and your parents have different perspectives, but when you describe that they built you a lab, or that they, would take you to the bookshop all the time because you were interested, or whatever the case is, that sounds very open to me. Because when I hear about a lot of other Pakistani parents, the focus is all on school and not getting hurt and towing the line and being respectful and, all of these things. And I'm not saying that wasn't the focus in your case, but it seems like your parents were a lot more open to providing you the opportunity to explore things you were interested in. And that comes in part from openness, that those things are valuable. And maybe it wasn't, like, I'm not sure if that was a deliberate piece or it wasn't deliberate, right? That's hard to say.
Yeah, that's the thing. So I don't think it was deliberate, but definitely they were very, very, very open. And it's not even like they saw some like amazing hope in me or something like that. They just saw that I was interested in something and it wasn't anything bad. Like obviously I was getting into electronics and at a very early age and computer programming. And at that time, computer programming, nobody really paid much attention to it. This is almost before the internet. So they were just going with their instincts. I wasn't doing anything bad. It was all for education, but it was a different form of education and they let me do it. Although I was doing bad in elementary school, they let me go along with it. I didn't get into too much trouble for not performing well in school. And likewise for my brother, when my brother was doing excellent in school, my parents were like sure cheering him on, but they weren't then turning to me and saying, oh, look at your brother and look at you. It was never a comparison. And I've never felt like inferior in that regard because he's doing so well in school and I'm doing so bad in the same school. But I never had that feeling where, okay, he's doing so well, what's wrong with me? I never felt it because I was kind of getting good in other things that were sort of intangible. And over time, it's kind of worked out. But I mean, even I couldn't have predicted it. And my parents definitely couldn't have predicted it.
I wonder how they did that, not comparing. Because comparison happens two ways. Sometimes comparison happens because your parents are comparing you. Whether it's talking to you directly or your sibling or to their friends, whoever, sometimes you hear the comparison. And sometimes you make the comparison on your own and sometimes it's both, right? And especially when you talk about school, that's something that often people compare in. Or like I could see parents being like, okay, you're not doing well in school, stop doing all this other stuff, go back to studying more, studying harder, or whatever is required to get you to a different place in the school system. But they didn't do that. So they were operating from some sort of philosophy or perspective on what's important. And I'm very curious as to what that is for them.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure. My theory is that they weren't really trying so hard and they weren't really following any kind of guidance. They were just kind of like going along with the flow. That's my theory. But it doesn't seem like any of it was really that well planned. They were just like, okay, this person is good at this. Okay, we'll help them. This person is good at that. I'll help them in that direction. But there was never an expectation, which is the important thing. So there was never an expectation to perform a certain way. But they definitely had a huge role to play. I remember like I once built a dish receiver, like for channels. And it was a big project because it's like a lot of circuitry in it. And once I built it, my dad was so happy about it. And then he said, what do you want to do with it? Because, we didn't have any channels. So I said, I want to sell it. So he helped me find a customer. So I sold it and I made like, at that time it would have been something like $50. So I was so happy. It was never like, okay, we're doing it for this reason. It was always like, okay, what do you want? We'll just do that.
So I feel like the differentiator for you and what you're talking about is you feel like it wasn't planned or forced. Like it wasn't like they were like, oh, you're interested in this, you're going to this class, or we want you to be interested in this, or you're going to go do this. There was no plan like that. Whereas you see a lot of that, especially now. But at the same time, there was you're interested in this thing, what do you want to do? And them taking whatever steps they could to help you do that thing, which I think is deliberate. Because in my experience, being a parent, there's so many things competing for your time, right? And you have siblings as well. So they have to give each child some attention in terms of what are they interested in. So one is trying to figure out what are your kids interested in. And two is then trying to figure out how do you then provide an opportunity for them to further that interest in something.
Right.
So you have to really pay attention to be able to do that. And you have to be willing to seek out opportunities to help further those skills. I think it comes naturally to some people versus other people for sure. But I don't think it happens in happenstance, like by mistake.
I agree. I think you're right. I mean, even when my dad bought a computer, we were not well off. So buying a computer was not an easy thing. It was like 6 months of salary or something like that.
Wow.
So buying a computer when nobody else had a computer for literally no reason at all, just so we could, have a computer. He didn't think we were going to start programming. Just thought everyone is moving towards computers. Let's get a computer.
Yeah.
And he didn't get it for himself. He never even used it. So I don't know how you get that conviction.
Next,
but
Jawad
there was
talk
obviously
more about his
something
personality.
there.
Yeah.
I couldn't make
anxiety
decisions like
issues
that.
may be coming from. We return to this idea of deliberate parenting, and we close off with a bit more conversation around character. You seem very go with the flow and accepting things the way they are. I'm sure there's more to you than what meets the eye, right? And, we've had a lot of these conversations, but most of our conversations are on a philosophical, intellectual sort of plane, not necessarily like an emotional plane. So I don't actually know much about the emotional side of your personality. Mostly what we've talked about is on the intellectual sort of side, right? Like what you think and how you process and that type of stuff. So admittedly, I don't have a good sense of what that other side looks like. But, right, like
I'm a psychopath.
Yeah, who knows, right? Like, I mean, that, when you're talking about feeling anxiety when you're watching someone do something wrong in a movie, for example, I wouldn't have guessed that. Not that it was surprising per se, but it was also not, like, sometimes you can tell, like, this person has probably a bit of anxiety. I'm one of those people. But I think you come across as very relaxed.
It took me a very long time to figure out why can't I watch suspenseful movies?
Yeah.
And I couldn't for a long time, when I'm watching a movie with Nadia, I have to like pause, because I really literally can't watch it. And it's a different sort of anxiety. Yeah, I mean, anxiety comes in many different ways.
Yeah.
But it's the kind of anxiety where I just can't see someone or myself doing something bad and then getting caught. I don't want that. And I think my memory of where it started from is a pretty bad one. Like when I was very young, maybe I think I was 4.5, 5 years old, and I was playing with some crayons, and some uncle auntie came to me and they said, "Oh, where did you get these crayons from?" And I said, I was really shy at that time, and I was like kind of quiet. I said, "Oh, I brought them," and they said, "No, you stole them." And I was like, and I wasn't crying, but I was like so heartbroken.
Yeah.
I think that moment always comes back to me, that feeling that you get blamed for something and you're like kind of helpless in that sense. So yeah, so it's kind of interesting, but I haven't really dug too deeply into it, but it's there somewhere.
So you said helpless, which I can definitely understand. It's also like this authority person, right? So an auntie, uncle, when you're 5 years old, they're a person of authority. They're coming and they're saying something that's not true, but you don't necessarily have the tools to be like, it's not true what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And you're kind of stuck in this place where you want to say something, but you don't have any agency to be able to say anything or know what to do in that situation. And that's very unnerving to be in,
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that it translates to movies. I think the part that I'm trying to understand is when you say they do something wrong. So what's wrong, I guess, is the first question. And then you said, and then when they get caught. You mentioned both parts of it. So I'm trying to understand that piece.
Well, let's say in a movie, somebody cheated on their husband, right?
Okay.
And then, like, as the scene goes on, they're about to be found out. And at that, I can't watch it. I really can't. And usually when I watch it, as soon as it's over, you're like, okay, well, it was a big deal. But that moment leading up to the guy finding out that his wife cheated on him, that I just really can't take it. And that's why I can't watch any spy movies, because there's always somebody would be spying, like, in the government or something like that. My feelings are for that person who's doing the bad deed or shouldn't be doing it. It's about just not doing what you're supposed to be doing. So I don't know what it is. It's interesting though.
It's not guilt though. You feel anxiousness at that time. It's
exactly.
Not,
yeah.
Right? Well, okay. Movies like that are meant to give you some of that feeling that you're feeling. The idea of suspense or almost getting caught or doing something wrong. when we see those things, they're supposed to trigger some sort of a reaction. So some of that, I think probably everybody experiences to some degree. But I think it gets to you on a different level than someone else.
Exactly.
Maybe because
Yes.
of the experience that you had, and maybe, I'm not sure. That's really interesting. I have to think more about that.
Well, we don't suffer from the events in our lives, right? We suffer from our judgment of them. And sometimes you just have to see it from the reverse perspective, right? Like get in somebody else's shoes and see yourself. And maybe you are more harsher to yourself than someone else would be. So it's very interesting. This place between your ears is like, it can be a very bad neighborhood. And it's unfortunate that we have to spend all our time alone in there. But yeah, that's why you have to be very careful.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think, when you talked about this, going way back to the beginning of our conversation, but when you talked about character versus personality, I've never really separated them before in terms of, when I think of core, I think of them kind of as the same. But when I think about myself, if I was going to describe myself, I think the core parts of my personality are wanting to help people and caring deeply about everything. Like,
right.
I think those are sort of, and I'm pretty loud now. Like, I was definitely shy for a period, but I think my core is actually, I'm pretty loud and I have opinions. And I think the other part that's really big in my personality is the recognition that there's a variety of perspectives that exist simultaneously. And like, you can be right and I can be right, even if we're saying different things.
I think the core of you is very difficult to change. I'll give you an example. So I think I have some anger issues, and nobody will ever see this anger because this anger is like not directed at anything, but it can flare up at certain points just once it builds up. But that is my goal. Like, you have to-do lists. People have daily to-do lists, monthly to-do lists. I have like 100-year to-do list. And my 100-year to-do list is interesting when you look back, like, what do you want in 100 years? And it's nothing like, oh, I want this success or that, or I want to have a car. None of that, right? You want to be a better person. So one of them would be to change my issues with anger, for example, or anxiety. But to change them is not easy. These are really, 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 really tough things to change. And no religion, nothing can like really change it for you. And no ritual, no praying like 100 times a day will change any of that. I think like you can become confused by those things, that you are becoming a better person. But those things are very difficult to change. Try changing those things. Those are the real difference makers in people's lives. And I think a lot of that is so deeply embedded in us that I'm not saying it's impossible to change. I mean, the brain is very malleable, but they're very, very tough to crack.
Well, it requires deliberate rewiring.
Yeah, deliberate rewiring through deliberate practice.
Yeah,
and
over time.
It's like learning to play guitar or whatever. It's over time you have to deliberately practice and try to improve it, recognize the situation every time. You look at Buddhists, what are they doing? Essentially all they're doing is being mindful of their present moment. Simply said, but not easy to do, right? They spend their entire life, and they've been spending the last 3,000 years perfecting that knowledge and being able to control their emotions. So when issues like anxiety, stress arise in their mind, they can carefully like massage it out. So it's not easy. The stuff is not easy. What I'm saying is no amount of rituals are going to change any of that. It's really like exactly what you said, like deliberately rewiring your brain over time with a lot of practice that can maybe have some impact.
Well, it also depends on what you mean by rituals, right? Because rituals could be practice of rewiring over time. But I think you're trying to say it's like there's no easy fix. You have to really work at it. And it takes a lot of persistence. So you said you feel like you have anger issues. I don't think I've ever seen you angry. But when you say that, what do you mean?
It's the kind of anger that nobody would see it, because it's not like a crazy aggressive, like I'm going to beat you up kind of anger. It's the normal kind of anger, and it's hard to even describe it, but it's usually triggered by not being able to maybe explain something sometimes. I always recognize it as a problem with communication on my own part. But it's not the kind of anger that people usually think about. It's different. Kind of like frustration is the word. And it's always been there because I don't think I'm very good at communicating. So I always find that there's this barrier.
So, okay, give me an example. Because I think when you say you feel like you're not good at communicating, I think you're talking about something very specific, like a type of communication or about something specific. I mean, a whole conversation you've been communicating, right? And you're often talking about things that will go above people's heads, but I think you do a good job at explaining things so that they're easy to understand or at least digestible. So when you say that, I think you're talking about something specific.
I don't like to have to explain every little detail because some of it should be obvious, but I feel like I sometimes have to. And obviously it's not obvious. I struggle with the idea that having to explain that little of details to someone, because if I had to explain it to my nephews and stuff like that, I would struggle. I don't know how to put it all together because in my mind it's all jumbled up. So I think that will lead me to frustration. But it's not really like anger in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
It's just like frustration with myself. It's not like I'm frustrated at the kid. Yeah. It's like, why can't I explain it? It's all in my head. I know it's there, but how do you get it out? So that's kind of like the feeling. And it's mostly with, people who are very close to you when you have to communicate at a different level. When you have to just talk in words, like we're talking about Raptors game or something like that. And I could talk about it all day long, but it's when you have to communicate something that is more deeply ingrained, but it's like kind of difficult to do it. So that's what I think.
And sort of going back to the example that you gave with the crayons.
Mm-hmm.
So, this adult is saying this thing to you. That's not true. But you don't know how to explain that it's not true. You're almost at a loss for words.
Yeah. And it's actually very interesting that you pointed it out. So another experience I had was later on. I was 14 years old, almost about to come to Canada. And I was in my class and I was just going to go drink water. So I was just leaving the class. And my math teacher, he was angry at some students and he was going around smacking them.
Oh,
and he just happened to see me and he smacked my face as well. I've been smacked around so many times. I was like, I told you, not the greatest student in Pakistan.
Oh.
So I got smacked so bad and my glasses went flying and they broke, right? And I'm like, what just happened? And then I'm standing outside of headmaster's office along with those other kids. And when the headmaster came to ask me, and I really honestly couldn't even explain. Like, it was just like, I didn't even know how to explain it. I just didn't. I just took it. And it's really strange, but it's there. Something is there. One day I'll figure it out.
Well, both the examples you gave, you didn't do anything wrong, but you were treated as if you did something wrong. And then there's frustration in the ability to not be able to defend yourself and to say, I didn't do something wrong here. Like, I didn't do anything. Because you don't even know where to begin that explanation.
Yeah.
You don't have words for it. And you don't really know where to begin in your explanation. So it's easier not to give one, A. And then B, it's sort of frustrating to you that you're not able to communicate something in a simple, straightforward way. Like, both the examples you gave could have been something that was straightforward. Like, no, I didn't steal them. Or, I didn't do anything, he thought I did. Right? Like, in a sentence, it could have happened. But at those moments, you didn't have any words. Like, you just couldn't articulate the words, which happens all the time to everybody in different situations, And so maybe it's that. It's the frustration of, this should be simple to explain, but I can't seem to be able to do it.
Yeah, and I think that's probably it. But it's a problem, right? Like, it should be addressed. Not a problem like that's external, right? It's an internal problem.
Well, I mean, some of addressing it, I think, comes to being more understanding for yourself, because it is really hard to break certain things down, and everybody struggles with breaking different types of things down. So a lot of the stuff that you talk about with me, I would struggle to break that down to someone else. I understand it when you're explaining it to me, and I can have a conversation about it. But if I, went to Aman later on today and was like, Jawad was telling me, I probably couldn't explain it well enough because I'm not as well versed in that topic, right? But there's other things that when you have a kid, you have a choice. This goes back to being deliberate. Your parents had a choice. They could have seen things you were interested in and not cared. Or provided you with a smaller opportunity to experience them, or when you weren't doing well in school, taking it away, like seeing it as a hobby and not as education. They could have chosen to do that. They didn't. So it's the same thing. When Isa asks me a question, I have a choice. Do I answer his question in the most simplest way possible? Which I wish I did more of, but I don't ever do. Did more of because it would be easier for me to do that. Or do I try to give him like a balanced response? Or if I don't know the answer, do I look up the answer, right? Or do I just say like, I don't know, and leave it at that? And every day you're confronted with these choices, and you feel them more with kids, I think, because they ask you 1,000 questions all the time. And you're tired and you're trying to figure out, like, how do I answer this question, right? So going back to you, though, I think it's trying to understand that while something might seem straightforward and you're frustrated that you can't explain it, all of us, even those of us who might be very good at explaining things, we all have things that are a little bit more difficult for us to explain. And it just requires being patient with yourself and explaining it. And sometimes when you explain something to someone, they don't understand. And so then you try explaining it a different way, until it does sort of make sense. I think the expectation to be readily able to explain something is sometimes what sets us up for failure, because when it doesn't readily come to you, then it becomes overwhelming. Like it defeats you almost,
Right.
For me, you were talking about EQ, right? So I generally have a pretty high EQ. Most of the time I'm able to feel what people are feeling. Or like if you're telling me a story, I'm able to see, how that connects with another thing, or I'm able to tap into what emotions you might be feeling or whatever. And that normally comes readily to me. But sometimes it doesn't. And like when it doesn't, I find that much more frustrating. And also it makes me self-conscious because that's something I thought I was good at,
Right.
And if explaining things generally is something you are good at, then when you're not able to in these situations, it could be something that then you get hung up on and frustrated by. Like, why can't you?
Right. Right. Yeah.
So I think it's trying to be patient with yourself, and that's okay, and that happens.
Right. Yeah. No, it makes sense. Yeah. You should be Dr. Phil.
Yeah, this is gonna, pave the way into, do I want to be a therapist instead? 20 years from now, let's say you do have a child, you have a son, okay? And he's now giving your eulogy, and he's talking about who you were.
20 years?
Oh, whatever. Let's say 40 years from now. I'm giving you an early death, Jawad. Whatever.
Nice.
You know what I mean, right? 40 years, 50 years from now, whatever. And he's describing you. Right? He's giving your eulogy. What do you hope he says about you?
Actually, interestingly enough, I have this written down somewhere already. And because I have like 100-year list as well. Mm-hmm. So it's based on somebody saying something about me. And it's not anything drastic. It's basically, here was a simple guy who lived a simple life. And he died simply. And he walked simply. And in that whole process, he didn't hurt too many people. And that's it. Someday I hope that, I can pass on some of my brain, a little bit of it. Mm-hmm. Not that it's that amazing, but some of it, I would like to pass it on to somebody. But if that doesn't happen, that's fine as well. Mm. But I would really like to tread lightly on this planet and leave just as I came. That would be the ideal. But I had it written down somewhere, so I'm just repeating what
the decision you had made at that time?
Yeah, exactly.
When you wrote it down?
Yeah.
I think what I'm going to do is try to extrapolate based on this conversation what I think some of your attributes would be.
Sure.
Because it is very difficult.
I'm not a very strong personality, right? You can't really say anything this or that. I'm not like...
I don't know, man. I don't know. No. Generally, the word I use to describe you is you're very interesting, which I've always felt and continue to feel is that you're one of the most interesting people I know. And you're so different from other people. Not in a trying to be unique sort of way, but just because that's who you are. And also very different from me. I enjoy our conversation so much because I think we do have some similarities, but we're also very, very different. And so the conversations are so my question to all of you is the same question I asked at the beginning.
Based
on this conversation, what words would you use to describe Jawad's character? I do have some thoughts of my own, which I talk a bit about in the conversation. But I'd be really curious to hear what you guys think. And do you feel that character and personality are separate? And what defines character for you? Could you define your own character? So those are some of the things that I'm interested in hearing about, as well as any other comments you have about anything else that we talked about, especially as it relates to the parenting piece about being deliberate. Until next time, take care.